Hi, I'm Akshay, and today we have with us MediaNama's editor and founder Nikhil Pahwa. So recently, there has been a change in the leadership of IAMAI, and it has been quite controversial. So we have Nikhil here to tell us what's the controversy all about and why are people talking about it. Over to you, Nikhil.
Thanks, Akshit. So the IAMAI elections were held. Now, what is the IAMAI? The IAMAI is the Internet and Mobile Association of India. It was set up like almost 2 decades ago to help further the Indian startup ecosystem, technology companies, etc. So many of the old founders, people who were involved with the internet industry, like back in the really initial days, they formed the IAMAI along with Shubore, who was previously with CII, and Shubo was and is the president of the IAMAI. So they formed the IAMAI to represent the views of Indian startups to the Indian government. So it's a lobbying organization, just like any other lobbying organization. And but it was at that time it only mostly had Indian companies as a part of it. It over a period of time expanded its scope to also include foreign companies. Now, so the IMA is important because typically, historically, what has happened is that its views are seen as the views of the Indian startup ecosystem. They're seen to represent tech companies, and many tech companies sign up with the IMAI. They have this annual conference called the India Digital Summit, and many ministers have actually spoken at the India Digital Summit. So it's like what NASSCOM is for the IT services industry. IMAI is seen as being for the internet industry. Except that one of the things that I've always pointed out about the IMAI is that it is representative of a handful of startups, and maybe 200, 300. I remember at one point in time, they just had 215 members. The Indian startup ecosystem is very large. There are thousands of startups, but most of them are not members. But it's seen as being representative of a large number of startups. So the controversy around the IMAI has been a couple of things. One, over the last many years, what has happened is that its chairmanship has been largely big tech, so global big tech, right? So, for example, Sanjay Gupta of Google was the chairperson there. The vice chair was Shivnath Thukral of Meta, right? So the thing is that there has been a controversy because ever since the Google CCI issue and Indian startups versus Google, that issue started where, Google imposed a 30% fee. The Indian startup founders, since 2 years, have consolidated their actions into and started collecting and sort of representing a point of view that is not necessarily voiced by the IMAI. So, they formed an organization called ADIF, or Atmanirbhar Digital India Foundation, which is another lobbying organization that represents that group of founders. As a disclosure, even MediaNama joined the ADIF to figure out how it works and what it's doing. Um, and so ADIF has gone to CCI and filed a case against Google. It's now gone to court against Google. The CCI versus Google issues is been heavily involved in that. So, the startup founders feel that the ADIF represents views of the startup ecosystem or the Indian tech startup ecosystem much more than IMAI does. And this was more evident than ever before when in a draft sort of submission on the Digital Competition Act that was circulated, the IMAI largely said that there needs to be more evidence to understand whether we need a new competition bill and what the new competition bill should be like. Now, competition is a key issue because that's at the core of trying to break up the dominance of big tech in the space. And and so many of these founders were basically upset about the fact that the IMA is not representing an Indian startup point of view, which wants a competition bill, or at least the point of view of these old founders. And so there was this call out on Twitter, starting with Anupam Mittal, who's the founder of Sadi.com, uh, where he called out the IMAI, saying that they don't represent the Indian startup ecosystem anymore. They're representing big tech. And Anupam was one of the founders of IMAI, the old school founder. And so that led to like a lot of controversy around who does the IAMAI represent. And there was another group of people who, among Indian founders, and said that, there are new elections coming up for chairmanship of the IAMAI. And so instead of boycotting IAMAI, what about, more and more startups join and vote to change the leadership at IAMAI? And that's exactly what's happened. So many companies, including Anupam's company, Shadi.com, that was no longer an IMAI. Many of them rejoined, paid, I think they must have paid that 1.2 lakh rupees of fees to the IMAI charges or thereabouts that they charged to join. And then there was a voting process for the governing council. Now, the entire governing council, so Harsh Jain of Dream 11 is the chairman. Um, Rajesh Mago of Make My Trip is the vice chair. Satyan Gajwani of Times Internet is the treasurer. So the three leadership positions have been now taken up by Indian companies, and pretty much the entire governing council looks like it has, uh, you know, uh, Indian companies as members, and there isn't a single company in that list that is actually a foreign company or a multinational company that is not run by an Indian founder. So there's been a complete transition in terms of how the chairmanship has changed at the IMAI, um, and and that's it's almost like it's now supposed to be representing the Indian startup ecosystem, and where previously it was not.
Okay. So now, as we have a new leadership at the IAMAI, my next
Hmm.
question to you is, why does it matter who get appointed to this industry body? How does it affect people in the real world and businesses?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, the views of the IMA are seen as views of the Indian startup ecosystem, and that's what the controversy was, that people believe that IMA doesn't represent the startup ecosystem because they don't represent the views of these Indian founders. And so why it matters is that, when there are government policy that are being formed, the IMAI invariably always gets invited, or they are asked to send representation, or they are asked to bring founders to government meetings who want to talk about a particular issue, because the government doesn't necessarily know all the founders, all the startups, who something impacts. So the IMAI plays an important role in terms of curating people that the government can invite for a meeting on an issue that might impact them. Um, in many instances, what we've seen is that, on particularly tricky instances, IMAI has a particular process. They have committees, and like there's an e-commerce committee or there's an edutech committee, uh, and so there are committees that basically decide. So they also draft submissions to government consultations. Those are run through the committee. The committee approves those submissions. It's all a fairly internal democratic process that is supposed to represent the views. So it's more about how the IMA is perceived. So, the media quotes the IMAI as being representative of the startup ecosystem. The government invites people via the IMAI. ADIF also has the same sort of role now. NASCOM also has some internet members and they also participate. So all of these organizations, which are largely lobbying groups, are essentially important voices when it comes to government policy making. So who is at the helm of IMAI? Who chairs the IMAI? That has an impact on what is the kind of representation that is made, who's in the governing council, who's in the committees. All of those things have an impact on whether the IMAI takes a position, what position it takes, whether it decides it's going to it's not going to take a stand, or it's going to represent multiple points of view. All of these things in terms of just representation to the government, the IMAI, who's in the IMAI, who's a member, who's a chairperson, all of that has an impact.
So IAMA as an organization has submitted its thoughts and it has its own views in a way. So my question is, how will this change in the coming future with the new leadership joining in? What kind of
So
issues
one,
will change in IAMA?
so let's take the draft representation on the Digital Competition Act, right? I think that. IMS submission on that now might change drastically, because it might actually say that, now we need a Digital Competition Act, where it was earlier saying that we need more evidence, which is actually a correct point of view, because you can't just do competition law on the basis of, and there are committees and other instances where it's been mentioned that there needs to be more evidence about harm and how competition has to be regulated. IMS position there might actually change now, in saying that instead of evidence, they might just say that yes, we need an act, and yes, this is what we need in that act. Um, so it depends on what committees will be formed, who will chair those committees, who will review the submissions, who will draft the submissions. IMA has a policy team that does its own drafting as well, but it all is based on inputs that come from that committee meeting. So that all of that might change now. Um, the other thing is that in the future now, because all of these founders are now voices within IMAI, the stance that it takes on issues might become more um, nationalistic in one way, or let me put it this way, they might become less global internet focused, more trying to benefit the founders that are now a part of this ecosystem. I mean, my view is that IMAI is not the Indian startup ecosystem. ADIF is also not the Indian startup ecosystem. Nobody represents, no lobbying organization represents an entire ecosystem. They represent the people that they have as members, right? So the my what will change at IMA in the future, the position that they reflect might that they represent will change, because there's a full leadership change.
Okay. And just last question before we end this, as we are saying that there's a division based on if you are an Indian startup or if you're not an Indian startup or if you're a big tech, not a big tech. Is that the right way to go about forming organizations within organizations? Will this benefit anyone in the end? And should Google and Facebook be worried with this change, or is it not a big thing for them?
That's a good question. So I think Google and Facebook and all global big tech firms should be worried, because now it's possible that IMAI will have them in their crosshairs. Like ADIF is very clearly targeting Google on the CCI issue. If there is, for example, regulation around dominance in advertising, uh, then obviously you have a situation where big Google and Facebook dominate digital advertising in the country. Both of them could be targeted. Of course, there is also potential for collateral damage, like for example, Zomato and Swiggy to collectively dominate the food delivery space. Ola and Uber collectively dominate the gig aggregate, like the taxi aggregator space. Naukri.com is a monopoly, pretty much a monopoly when it comes to job postings online. So these are all dominant players, and so there might be collateral damage, but very clearly there's going to be. I mean, with this representation and given how much we've seen in terms of how passionate these guys are about the nationalism, the national versus multinational, or Indian versus foreign angle, um, I think we will see much more we will see changes in how the IMAI works. Is it the right approach? Personally, I don't think so. I don't think countries should look at this from a national foreign perspective. All companies are global. I mean, when you look at, let's say, some of these companies, how much of their shareholding is actually Indian? Because for many of them, a majority shareholding is by VC funds and PE funds, and a lot of that is foreign shareholding. So, what's how do you define what is an Indian company? Uh, Google, for example, has Google India Private Limited. Google India Private Limited, for all practical purposes, is an Indian company with foreign shareholding. There are instances where there are founders of companies, but the shareholding of that company is largely foreign, right? And before listing, for example, over 70% of Paytm's ownership was with Alibaba and a bunch of with Ant Financial and essentially foreign investors. So, what is an Indian company is a question. Just because a founder is foreign doesn't make it. I mean, or is Indian doesn't make it an Indian company. Look at Flipkart, right? Sachin Bansal and Benny Bansal did not have majority shareholding in the company, and once it was sold to Walmart, did it suddenly become did Flipkart become from an Indian company to a foreign company? So If it depends on the quantum of your shareholding. And when you look at laws should apply equally to all companies in the country, whether it is Indian or it is foreign. If you start making laws to discriminate against foreign players, and it is so evident, what will that do? That will basically reduce the confidence that investors have in investing in companies in the space. It will reduce the confidence that companies have in investing in the market. And then that's not going to bode well for the Indian startup ecosystem. If if Indian companies want to go global and they want to start playing in other markets, including the US market, they shouldn't, would they not expect equal treatment under law in those markets? Why is it that we are looking at this in a manner like China does, which is it discriminates against foreign players in the market and preferences local players? We've grown up with an Indian ecosystem which is global, which is participative. Startups have benefited from the availability of global services on the platform. Now, when you start with a discriminatory approach, that's only going to lead to internet fragmentation. It's going to lead to fewer availability of services. And that's not necessarily going to be good for consumers. At the end of the day, we should look at what benefits consumers the most.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you for these wonderful insights. Thanks a lot.